welcome back to Tariq Amba podcast and videocast. This is your host, Salomon Kabrigi. I hope that you have been enjoying the three-part series on the Battle of Adwa, which we just completed. It was a lot of work and it took quite a bit of time to compile all the information. Those episodes have been a little longer than the previous episodes. I think with the level of detail that people seem to prefer, our episodes going forward will be a little longer than the ones that you were used to coming from me in the early part of this podcast. So I hope that everyone found them informative and interesting, and I welcome any feedback, questions, as always. We did receive a couple of questions, which I will be answering today. But I'm always looking for more. And if anyone has questions on previous episodes, please send them in. You can comment on the videos themselves on YouTube, or you can email me at solomon@tariqamba.com. And you can find me on social media. I'm on Facebook as myself, Solomon Kabrige, but there's also a page, Tariq Amba Facebook page, and we are on Instagram and TikTok and Twitter as well. So look for us on your favorite social media platform. And Tariq Amba is on the audio-only podcast platforms as well. We're on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. Look for us on your favorite podcast platforms as well. The episodes on the podcast platforms are a little behind the ones on YouTube. We are up to episode 3 of Emperor Amdetzion I on the podcasts. The podcasts will go in chronological order. So the YouTube channel has jumped around a little bit. As you know, we've gone from the Solomonic Restoration and reached Amdetzion III. Amdetzion I, the third episode of Amdetzion I. And after that, we went to into modern Ethiopian history. We talked about the Yekati 12 massacre and Adwa. But we will be going back to the medieval period shortly and continuing on to the emperors that came after Amdetzion I. But if you have any questions about any of the episodes, whether it's on the platforms, the audio platforms, podcast platforms, or on YouTube, please send them my way. I love questions and I like feedback of any kind, whether it's criticism or questions or encouragement. I welcome it all. So thank you for those that already have done so. People have been very kind with their comments, and I've received also many very helpful suggestions. So thank you for those as well. I would like, first, before I do anything else, would like to thank someone for some really wonderful work that they did for me. Many of you have commented and complimented the new intro to my videos and the music, the graphics, as well as the music and graphics at the closing credits. These were done for me along with our new logo by a dynamic young Ethiopian gentleman by the name of Henok Deriba. He is in Ethiopia and he runs a company called Colordem Design Studio. I will have a link at the bottom of this video to his website. He does really amazing graphics work. He redesigned our logo. He did that beautiful intro for me and did business cards for me. Very, really top-notch professional work. And I can't say enough about him. I will have his website in the description of this video down below. So if any of you have the need for a good graphic designer with and good quality music to go along with it, etc., he's the person to go to. So can't recommend him enough, and he's a really nice guy. So go out and support your fellow Ethiopians in their endeavors. I believe in that, and I think we should all help each other out. And he's top notch. He did really amazing work, as many of you have seen. So if any of you know of other up and coming young Ethiopian artists or businessmen that you think I should feature, please let me know, and I will look into them and we'll give them a platform here. Should all help each other out. In the same spirit, I have on my website, which is www.tarikamba.com, I have a new page. As for those of you who haven't visited the website, our YouTube episodes are on there, along with links to the audio podcast. But there are also other useful bits of information. There are links to the Instagram page where a lot of historic pictures are posted, and there's a page with some of these complicated family trees. I try to be as user-friendly as possible when it comes to talking about people's ancestries and descent on my channel, but sometimes you just have to look at a family tree. So I am posting family trees of the various branches of the Solomonic and Zagwe dynasties, as well as other important families in Ethiopia, and with the thought that this will be helpful for viewers and listeners. So check out the family trees, but I also have a new page on the website which features my book recommendations, and there's a whole list of books on there. These are books that I think are good for people interested in Ethiopia to read, and they're all very interesting books. But I have 3 new recommendations. These are relatively new books, and I really encourage people to read them. The first book I will recommend today is Appa Nefso, an Ethiopian Hero by Seleshi Shaul. Now, this is a book about the Ethiopian war hero Dejazmach Balcha Safo, who's also known as Balcha Abba Nefso. Abba Nefso was his horse name, or his warrior name. And it's written by Seleshi Shaul, who is a relative of his. And this is a excellent book. It talks about this really extraordinary hero who fought in the Battle of Adwa, and again fought in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and actually gave his life during the Second War. And he was killed by the fascists in 1937. A really, really impressive figure from Ethiopian history, and I highly recommend this book. Something really wonderful about this book is that it's both in English and Amharic, and it's which I think is extraordinary. This podcast is really directed to anyone who's interested in Ethiopian history, but it was inspired by the need of young Ethiopians in the diaspora who don't necessarily speak Amharic and would like to get some of this historic information. So this book is actually a resource for them. It's very interesting. It's written in English and Amharic, and it's all in one place. So I encourage people to buy it. It's really a great book. The second book that I'm going to recommend during this episode is an Amharic book, is Jegna Arbenya Kibur Ras Amara Wubineh Tesama by Wezero Ethiopia Wubineh Tesama. Now, for those of you who don't know, Ras Wubineh Tesama was a hero of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, and this is a biography written about him by his daughter, Wezero Ethiopia Wubineh. It's an excellent book. It's in Amharic, and it has a lot of personal insight. No one knows someone better than a family member, and Ras Wubineh was really a very impressive figure in Ethiopian history. And his story needs to be told, and I'm very glad that Wezero Ethiopia did this. A lot of people, a lot of historic figures have passed on without writing their life stories themselves, or with their children or grandchildren having written books about their parent or grandparent. And it's very regrettable because lots of stories, lots of history is lost that way. So I applaud Utopia for doing this, and I think this is an excellent book, and we should support them by purchasing it. I'm sure it will be available in Ethiopian bookstores, places that sell Ethiopian books in various areas around the U.S. So that is the second book that I am recommending. The third book I would like to recommend today is a book titled Brigadier General Deriba by Ataman Tatsige. It is a book about the 1916 coup attempt against Emperor Haile Selassie from the perspective of a son of General Deriba. General Deriba was one of the coup leaders in 1960. The Imperial Guard had attempted to take over government when the Emperor of Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie, had gone on a state visit to Brazil. And this book comes from a unique perspective. A lot of the time we've seen books written from different perspectives on historical events, but this is really an interesting book in that it comes from a perspective from a family member of a person who was deemed to be a coup leader. There haven't been a lot of those, so this is a very interesting book, and it's a new and very interesting perspective. There are some very unexpected stories in here, so I don't want to give the plot away, but I really encourage people to read this book. It's fascinating. So those are my recommendations, book recommendations this time round. There will be more from time to time, and like I said, on our website there is a page devoted to books that we recommend for those interested in Ethiopian history, and there are actually links from those books straight to Amazon where you can purchase these books. I'd like to take this opportunity to plug a project that's very dear to my heart. Those of you who follow me on social media will have seen me mention this project. It's a documentary titled Grandpa Was an Emperor. It was co-produced by Corinne Lepouk and Constance Marks, and Constance Marks also directed this film. The team of Corinne Lepouk and Constance Marks was previously responsible for the critically acclaimed Being Elmo, A Puppeteer's Journey, a documentary about the making of the Elmo character from Sesame Street. Very good documentary, and highly recommend for people who are interested in that subject matter. But this particular project, Grandpa Was an Emperor, follows the story of Yeshi Kasa. Emebit Yeshi Kasa is the daughter of Dejazmach Kasa Woldemariam, who many Ethiopians will remember as being the president of Haile Selassie University at one point, and also the Minister of Agriculture at the time of the Wollo famine, which was a very critical point in Ethiopian history. Her mother was Princess Sable Desta, who was the granddaughter of Emperor Haile Selassie, which makes Yeshi Kasa the great-granddaughter of the Emperor of Ethiopia. This film follows Yeshi as she looks back to confront the events of 1974 when her great-grandfather was overthrown and Ethiopia came under the rule of the Marxist military Derg regime. And all that has happened to her family and to Ethiopian society at large since that time. It's a very critical look at events that happened, and it is fascinating. It is a beautifully made film. It's very emotional, very moving, and I recommend it highly. Grandpa Was an Emperor has been shown at limited film festivals on both the east and west coast of the United States, and it was briefly streamed when it was playing at the NYC Doc Film Festival here in New York City. I highly recommend it that you watch it when it becomes more widely available. They are currently seeking a distribution deal, and I'm sure that will happen very shortly. Everyone who's seen this film has been extremely complimentary about it. It is a really wonderfully made documentary. And I encourage you to see it. And that's not just because I have a small part in it. I am in the film very briefly, and I consulted a little bit with the film. But the story is really compelling, and it will speak to everyone. I mean, it spoke to me at many levels, not only because I am Ethiopian by birth, but it's a very human story, and it should appeal to anyone who is a human being, really. It's just an excellent story. So I recommend it highly. It isn't quite available yet, but it should be very shortly. And when it does, stay tuned to the space. I will let you know when it's available. But I encourage you to look for it so that you can see it at the earliest opportunity. So going to the questions on recent episodes. We had a few questions, and some of those questions were subsequently answered in the following episodes. One question that we received was, did Italy have black soldiers? Certain people were very surprised to see that there were black soldiers in the Italian army fighting for Italy. And yes, Italy did have what were called askaris, or native soldiers, that were recruited from their colonies. There were Eritreans fighting for Italy, there were Somalis fighting for Italy, there were Libyans fighting for Italy. Italy also recruited soldiers from other countries' colonies. There were Sudanese that were fighting for Italy. They were recruited, and they weren't really mercenaries because they were enlisted, and they were part of the Italian forces, but they had been recruited and they had moved to the Italian colonies to serve in the Italian military there. So this was not a practice that was unique to Italy. Most colonial powers had native troops. Great Britain was probably the biggest example of this. They had many armed forces that were recruited from their colonies. There were West Africans, East Africans, Asians, and to a certain extent there are still foreign soldiers, most notably the Gurkha regiments in the UK right now, are recruited from Nepal. And Nepal never was a British colony, but they recruited soldiers from Nepal to form the Gurkha regiment. But France had native African soldiers, and it wasn't just in sub-Saharan Africa, but in North Africa as well. There were native soldiers that were recruited by the colonial powers. There was also a comment that there were certain heroes of Adwa that we did not mention or did not mention enough. And I acknowledge that's very true. With the limited time that we would have for a podcast episode or a video cast episode, it just really isn't enough time to cover everybody in a story as big as the Battle of Adwa and the conflict between Italy and Ethiopia. I tried my best to be as broad as possible, and but I wanted a certain amount of detail, and with that amount of detail, you really do have to cut through a lot. But there are other major figures from that time period who perhaps were just mentioned, but maybe deserved more coverage. This is not the last that you will hear about this period from me. I certainly intend on having episodes about the reign of Emperor Menelik II. Was one of the transformative leaders of Ethiopia. It'll probably be more than one episode about Menelik II. But there are other figures, important figures during his reign who probably deserve their own episodes, and will probably get their own episodes going forward. Empress Taitu certainly deserves her own episodes. Fitarari Hapta Georgis, Ras Walda Georgis, Ras Mukonnen, who received a lot of coverage because of his role as the de facto foreign minister for Emperor Menelik, but other figures deserve a lot more coverage, and they will be getting them in other episodes. So stay tuned. We will be getting back to this time of history, focused on other aspects of the times rather than the Battle of Adwa. This was a pretty big event in Ethiopian history, so it deserved its own series. But there are other aspects of that time that deserve discussion. The history of any country is very much centered on how it was governed and who governed it, and the changes and the trials and tribulations that came with that leadership. And for the majority of the history of the human race, monarchies have been dominant in the histories of these countries. So that is a very integral part of history, and it's an important part of history that we look into. Certainly, there are things that happen in history that outside of the kings and queens and emperors and empresses and lords, etc. But these figures are so important in why people lived a certain way, or where they lived, or the wars that affected them. So their stories are quite central. I received a question as to why I was so focused on monarchical history, the history of the kings and queens of various periods, and not so much on the history of the people. Well, part of that is because I personally am very interested in monarchy and in monarchical history. But also, a lot of the history that's recorded, and this is not unique to Ethiopia, but a lot of the history that is recorded is the history of the monarchs. Kings and queens around the world had their acts recorded, and so these are what are preserved and brought down to our times, and they are a lens through which we can see not just their stories, but the story of their times, and we get clues about how their people lived through these royal chronicles, so to speak. The same is true with religious institutions who record their own histories. So when we look at history, a great deal of our sources come either from the perspective of the monarch or the perspective of the church, particularly in medieval times, or the mosque for that matter. But when we come closer into modern times, to our times, then we start seeing more secular and more non-royal sources for history. But even then, the royal chronicles are a great source for us to find out what was going on, and we can deduce from these stories how life was for the people other than the monarchs. But those are the sources we have, and they're very interesting sources. So I guess the short answer is that's simply what I'm interested in. But the longer answer is that it is a window, that these monarchical histories are a window into how their people lived. Not just how they lived and what they did, but what their people did and how their people lived. So it takes a little bit of detective work, but it's all there. I will try to be as broad as possible with my sources. I'm not only looking at royal chronicles, but the people that were writing on historical topics in that period, or observers of things that were happening, often what they wrote about were the kings and the queens and the battles, and less about the mundane day-to-day things that people were doing. Of course, there were many great events that we can find. We know, for example, if there was an earthquake in a certain year, that there would have been, certain levels of misery. If there was a famine, if there was a drought, if there was a very heavy winter rainy season, we can deduce that there was hardship. So, yeah, we will try our best to be as broad as possible, but the framework of history is often built around these narratives of rulers and governments. So we'll do our best, but that's basically the sources that we have. There were some questions about Guksar Darge and what happened to him. In particular, there are questions about a photograph of Guksar Darge that I had put up. It was a photograph of him in his youth before he went to Europe. Of course, he's in his Ethiopian, he's wearing an Ethiopian shamma. But of course, once he moved to Europe, he began to dress in a European fashion and lived a very European style life. People were asking if I had any pictures of him when he was older, when he was collaborating with the Italians and so on. And, I really looked. I really looked very hard for pictures of him or Getaza Manuel, who accompanied him. And I found none. I know there must be pictures out there. And if anyone has pictures, please send them to me at solomon@tarikamba.com. I would love to have them. But I did not find any pictures. So that was the only picture of Guksa that I was able to find. And it's not terribly surprising due to the fact that he was disinherited by his father, and he was basically struck from the family tree, from the imperial family tree. And he died in exile, and he did have the benefit that his family did repatriate his remains to Ethiopia. And he, as I mentioned in that last episode, the last Adwa episode, he was buried at Debre Libanus a few years after he died. But he did die in exile. He never did return, and he was in utter disgrace. But he is not, as many of you know, he's not the first Ethiopian prince to die in exile. Many people know about Alemayehu Theodros. Dejazmach Alemayehu Theodros was the young son of Emperor Theodros II, who the British took out of Ethiopia in 1868, and he lived outside of Ethiopia after that. He was briefly in India, but spent most of his life in Britain, and died there at the age of 19, and remains buried there. He's buried at Windsor Castle. There will be an episode about Alemayehu Theodros, a very compelling story. But there was an even older incident of a Ethiopian prince who was exiled, and we are going all the way back to the reign of Emperor Susnius and his predecessor, Emperor Jacob. Emperor Jacob was overthrown by Emperor Susnius, and one of the sons of Emperor Jacob went into exile in Europe, and his name was Abitu Zaga Christos, or Zaga Christ, as the Europeans called him. And he died in France. Another very compelling story and another very compelling episode. So those are things that you have to look forward to. Yes, there has been a history of Ethiopian princes who have died in exile. Of course, there are others who have died since then in this current era, since the 1974 revolution. But this was a very rare instance before 1974. So those are all the questions and that we had for today. Please send in your comments, your questions, any feedback that you think that I should have, any suggestions, and we will carry on. Please remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share with your friends. Let people know that we're out here, and continue to support us. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.